Washington's unassuming gesture had instantly diffused the crisis. The United States and Britain went on to sign a treaty on September 3, 1783. In December, Washington appeared before Congress, handed over his sword, and resigned as Commander-in-Chief. His job was done.
The most amazing feature of Washington, I think, is the capacity to surrender power. Napoleon wouldn't do that. Cromwell didn't do it. Caesar didn't do it. Stalin didn't do it. Mao didn't do it. This is an unusual man who comes to embody the revolution, but is willing to walk away from power. Washington understands that in America and a republic, no matter how indispensable, all leaders are disposable, even him.
George Washington was a warrior of the purest sort, unbowed in defeat, generous in victory. At his core, he was a man who preferred liberty to power and justice to glory. In his ideals, as in his battles, Washington led from the front. His courage set the standard for future warriors. His sacrifices are the measure of our patriots. George Washington showed the way. It remains for us to follow.
They called him Old Hickory, America's first working-class president. A hero to the common man, a barbarian to the upper class, a cold-hearted demon to Indians, a steely-eyed fighter who made every battle personal. On dueling grounds, battlefields, and in the White House. A shrewd politician who branded his own form of democracy, who despised paper money, yet ended up on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson. On January 8, 1815, Major General Andrew Jackson faced the challenge of a lifetime. In the climactic battle of the War of 1812, 10,000 British redcoats invaded the South at New Orleans. One obstacle stood in the way of the British regaining their former colonies: Jackson and his ragged army of 4,000 militia, pirates, Indians, Creoles, and slaves. The British expected an easy victory, but they knew little of the man they were facing, whose determination to win was fueled by a deep personal hatred that went back more than 30 years. In 1781, when Jackson was 14 and the Revolutionary War was raging, British soldiers stormed a cabin where he and his brother Robert tried to hide. The boys were taken prisoner for serving as couriers in the Continental Army. 3 words from a British officer would light a fuse in Jackson that burned for a lifetime. Clean my boots.
Jackson, with that insolence that would characterize him for his entire life, refused. He said, "I'm a prisoner of war and I demand to be treated accordingly."
Jackson had always been a sassy kid, and now he was miffed at having been taken prisoner. And the officer pulls his sword and takes a swipe at Jackson's head. And Jackson throws up his arm and caught the sword on the side of his hand, but it didn't quite prevent the sword from hitting him in the head. And blood runs down for the rest of his life. He had this scar on his hand and a crease in his skull.
Andrew and his brother were taken to a squalid British prison camp where they both contracted smallpox. They probably would have died there, if not for their widowed mother, Elizabeth.
She essentially made her case to the British officers in charge of the camp, these are only boys. You got to let them out. A mother's love, a mother's anger ultimately sufficed to spring Jackson and his brother.
When she received 2 sons that were both desperately ill, she had only 1 horse, so she put the older boy, who was far worse, on the horse, and they walked about 40 miles. Jackson had to walk that distance behind them, still suffering from smallpox, and by the time they got home, the older boy was dead, and Jackson was delirious.
For 6 months, Elizabeth struggled to keep Andrew alive at their cabin in the Carolinas Waxhaw region. Her husband was killed in a logging accident. Her oldest son died fighting for the Continental Army. They were typical of frontier families.
The Westerners, the frontiersmen, they weren't people who were born to privilege or born to property. They were out on the frontier because they hadn't been doing so well where they came from. And they got used to the idea that whatever they were going to get in life, they were going to have to take.
Andrew survived the smallpox, but 6 months later, his mother died of cholera, leaving Andrew a bitter, tough young orphan.
He's taken up by one of the relatives, and he lives in the house, and there was some visitor who threatened him at one time, as I recall, and raised his hand to strike him. And the kid says to him, "If you touch me, if you strike me, you're a dead man."
As a young boy, he was a real hellion. I mean, he fought, he cursed, he drank, he smoked tobacco. He did everything he wasn't supposed to do, and his mama wanted him to be a Presbyterian preacher. That didn't work out.
As a teenager, Jackson had no interest in any particular vocation or education. Money was earned by gambling on horse races and dice games. But as he matured, Jackson realized his life had to change.
He wanted to better himself. He wanted more out of life. He decided that staying in the Waxhaws after the war offered nothing.
So he decided to do what at times it seemed half the population of the frontier did. He decided to become a lawyer. It was a natural for Jackson. He was an argumentative sort, and lawyers argue for a living.
But he eventually found his way to Salisbury, North Carolina, where he studied the law under the highly esteemed attorney, Spruce McKay. Spruce McKay had already taught the law to William Richardson Davie, a hero, Jackson's hero in the Revolutionary War.
So you found a lawyer who was well established and who had a law library, and you'd read. And if you had any kind of ambition, you'd gradually learn what lawyers did. You'd draw up wills, you'd draw up contracts, you'd learn the process. And if the clients wanted to risk their lawsuits on this young guy with very little experience, then it was their risk. And after a while, they discovered that Jackson was reasonably good at this.
Jackson, although poorly educated, had a great command of the language. And if you read his letters, you know, they're not well constructed always, and he would misspell a word, and misspell it in 4 or 5 different ways on the same page. Spelling meant nothing. It was the conviction, it was the passion, it was the temper that he wished to communicate.
For the first time in his life, 20-year-old Jackson had gained some respect. He began to shed the skin of his lower-class upbringing. But the suit of a gentleman proved an awkward fit.
Turn the circle halfway round.
After 3 years in Salisbury, North Carolina, Jackson had gained acceptance into town society. He wore the right clothes, said the right things. He even learned to dance.
He had a kind of charisma. It was a kind of personality that drew people to him because they thought, if you stick with this guy, you can accomplish great things. Jackson had high expectations for himself.